Hello and welcome. I'm Richard Golson, and I'm here to walk you through Guided Lab, creating a highly available environment. This is from our Architecture course, Module 10. In this lab, you're showing how to create this highly available environment using auto scaling with an application load balancer, and it deploys an EC2 instance in two different availability zones. So that means that we're going to provide the same application uh, environment in availability zone 1 and availability zone 2 using an autoscale group, which clones our server for us. And we'll be connecting that to the load balancer in the lab. So that way, when traffic is sent to the application, it will get sent to the application load balancer. It will not get sent directly to the application servers. And then those application servers, when they receive the traffic from the load balancer, will be able to interact with the primary database instance, whether it's the EC2 instance in private subnet 1 or in private subnet 2. They'll both be able to interact with the database instance. If availability zone 1 fails, then the environment will still have an application server and a database instance in availability zone 2. So that means that the RDS instance in availability zone 2 will become the primary. And this will happen seamlessly because this is part of that multi-AZ option that RDS makes available as part of their management of high availability for us. What we're really focusing on this lab is setting up auto scaling to get high availability, and that will allow AWS in effect to manage deploying new instances based upon monitoring the health of the instance itself or the environment the instance is launched into, because it's going to rely upon the application load balancer to check in with the instance on a regular basis just to determine if the instance is responsive. If the instance stops responding to those health checks, then the application load balancer will stop sending traffic there, and the autoscale group would be notified. Same thing if the autoscale group detects that the application server is no longer responsive, it will notify the load balancer. Ultimately, the autoscale group is responsible for replacing instances. So if we take a look here, we can see that here is our load balancer we've created, and it has a resource map that shows us that we're using port 80. And on port 80, it's going to forward to something called the target group, which is what we use to connect the targets, which are our EC2 instances, to the load balancer. And that's all going to happen on port 80. If we take a look at our target group, we can see that we've got two targets. One is healthy, one is unhealthy. If I do a refresh, I may find that that number changes, but here they are down here. So any kind of unhealthy target would get replaced. You can see this one is in draining status, and we'll talk about that in the lab. And then here we can take a look at auto scaling, and we can see a whole series of auto scale events as instances are launched and terminated. And in some cases, the termination is waiting on a connection to be completed. And so this whole environment is very robust. Finally, we can see over here that we have an RDS instance, and the configuration ultimately is going to be configured for a multi-AZ environment. And so that's what you'll be doing in the lab. So the lab takes about 40 minutes to complete. It might take a little bit longer. Notice there are a lot of working parts, so it may take some of those longer than others, so you may need to wait a little bit. This is going to create a steady state environment so that we are maintaining two EC2 instances. And this will even allow us to do things like replace an EC2 instance with a new instance that's been updated. So we want to update the application. We don't do it on the instance that's deployed. We'll do that on the AMI and then deploy a new instance from that AMI, replacing the old instance, and we'll have the new application. It's very easy to do. We'll talk about that more in the lab as you go through the process of building all of this out. All right, I want you to enjoy the lab. I think you will. This is a very cool kind of environment to be creating, and you'll see just how easy it is to set this up. Enjoy, and I'll see you in the coming tasks.